Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. I'm your host, Tushar Shetty. Now, 2025 was a pretty chaotic year. And as for a region as chaotic as South Asia, we saw a lot of pretty important developments. On the face of it, the story doesn't seem to be all that different from what we normally hear a lot of times from the region. Important democratic elections, India-Pakistan conflict, natural disasters, insurgencies in Pakistan's western frontier. Mm, to a lot of people, the story might seem like it's the same that we hear a lot, but the truth is that it's not really the case here. Because 2025 was also a time of substantial global disruption. And for the different countries in South Asia, this had substantial effects. So as we go into 2026, the question is not just how are political, economic, and security developments shaping the region's outlook in the future, but also how the changes to the global environment are going to affect how the regions plan and how the region's countries are affected in several different dimensions. And in order to help us understand these different developments, both on the global level and how they apply to South Asia, we have with us the indomitable Michael Kugelman, the senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and four-time appearance on his podcast. So very much a friend of the podcast. I hope so. So Michael, a happy new year and welcome back to Beyond the Indus.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you as well. Great to be back here with you. I appreciate being referred to as indomitable. It doesn't happen every day. I appreciate it. Look forward to our conversation.
So looking back on 2025, just to begin with, what were, in your view, some of the more consequential developments in the region that took place over the past year? And for want of a better term, who were the biggest, winners and losers of the region that emerged over the past year?
Yeah, it's a great first question. I mean, you referred to the region as chaotic. You said it was a chaotic year. I think it's a great way to describe it. I would say more broadly, it was a difficult year for South Asia, and certainly I think other regions in the world had even more difficult years, like the Middle East. But it was a tough year for South Asia, and I think that we could identify a very significant security crisis that played out, a very significant political crisis, and a very significant diplomatic crisis. In terms of the security crisis, I know we're going to talk about this later, but you had the most serious India-Pakistan conflict since their 71 war. It only lasted a few days in May, but in terms of intensity of hostilities, it was the worst in many decades. Um, in terms of a significant political crisis, there was an uprising in Nepal where you had the government essentially ousted. This, of course, followed what happened in Bangladesh, something similar in 2024. And so, this was unfortunately a protest that became violent. Lives were lost. An interim government came into power. We'll talk about this, I'm sure. There'll be an election in a few months, but pretty significant crisis for Nepal. When I talk about a diplomatic crisis, here I'm talking about the Trump factor. I mean, we know that the return of Donald Trump last year had incredibly consequential effects for the entire world, but certainly in South Asia, where 4 of the 8 countries in South Asia were hit with sizable tariffs from the Trump administration. Of course, none higher than India with its 50% tariffs. Linked to that, we saw the U.S.-India relationship experience its biggest plunge in ties, I would say, in a number of decades. So that was pretty significant in my view. And, there was a really big humanitarian crisis in South Asia as well, which I think tended to be overlooked. And another Afghan refugee crisis. There were significant numbers of Afghan refugees in Pakistan and also in Iran that were sent back to Afghanistan. The numbers are heartbreaking. I mean, this is something that's been playing out over a few years, particularly after Pakistan and Iran, historically the top destinations for Afghan refugees, have taken more hardline positions towards Afghans on their soil. So there was that. Now, in terms of the biggest winners and losers, if you think of the biggest winner, I would actually have to say Pakistan's military, right? You had this conflict with India, which I would argue ended in a draw. But I would argue that Pakistan's leadership, which these days at the end, ultimately comes down to the military, was able to sell the conflict as a victory to the Pakistani people. It was a pitch that was, I think, widely accepted, widely supported. And this is something that helped a military in Pakistan that has experienced significant levels of challenges, including hostility from the Pakistani public. It was able to recoup a lot of trust and support. And this also entailed Um, the Pakistan Army chief receiving a promotion to field marshal, which is only you only had one other field marshal in Pakistan's history. It was a military dictator decades ago. And I think that the conflict in how Pakistan performed was also something that led to momentum, resulting in a series of constitutional amendments that basically made Asim Munir, Pakistan's army chief, about as powerful as you could be. He's probably one of the most powerful individuals in any country right now. So I'd have to say that Pakistan's military was a big win. In terms of the losers, I think India was a big loser. India came into the year very confident. The external affairs minister, Dr. Jaishankar, I remember saying, "Well, some countries may be a bit nervous about the return of President Trump, but we look forward to working with President Trump." And we see how that turned out. And that's on India's relationship. Yeah, exactly. So India's its relationship with the U.S. is in a heap of trouble right now, and that's going to be pretty challenging for its relations with the U.S. this coming year as well.
Right, that's brilliant. And I think we're going to get into a lot of the issues that you've mentioned. So, through the interview, I'd love for you to also talk about the Nepal, the so-called Gen Z revolution that we've seen, and the election that's going to happen, I believe, in June or July of this year. But before we get into the actual analysis, I do want to ask you, as one of the world's most prominent South Asia analysts, that South Asia is a very chaotic region. Even as someone from there, it's sometimes difficult to keep track of different developments and issues and, understand both the historical trajectory and the multiple dimensions that we see in different sorts of issues here. And it also gets really hard to separate the signal from the noise with all the different news sources and the X posts and so on and so forth. And I wonder, as we go into your outlook for 2026, if you could give us some insight as to how you, as an analyst, tackle a region as large and as complex as South Asia. What's the sort of analytical framework through which you see the region, and how do you process new developments in the region and predict likely fallout? And maybe for my own interest, what data sources do you rely on to make sure that you have an accurate and well rounded understanding of the different scenarios ongoing?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're right. I mean, South Asia is a huge region. It's very diverse, and it's really difficult to get one's mind around it, even for those that have been studying the wider region for many years, as I have. Let's start with the last part of your question first, in terms of data sources. I trust in my network. I have a network of contacts across the region, which comprises scholars, it comprises journalists, it comprises analysts like me, it comprises business leaders, policymakers, so many. And so, one thing I do, and given the time difference, here in the U.S., first thing my morning is I'll check in with some of my contacts in countries where there's something that has particularly big happening in the news, just to sort of get a read. Sometimes they'll set a call. Sometimes this just happens over WhatsApp or Signal, and that's very helpful. That sort of situates my thinking each day, and sometimes each week as well. Obviously, if there's a big crisis playing out, like the India-Pakistan conflict last year, I'm in constant contact with my closest trusted contacts in both of those countries. So it's pretty simple in that regard. Certainly, I read open source intelligence, and I read, the news and so on. I try to avoid social media for any type of news source, except when I'm trying to get a sense as to reactions, sort of trends on social media. What are the issues that are getting the most traction in the countries of South Asia? That's very helpful. But as you know, I mean, not to be too blunt about it, I mean, social media has in some ways become a cesspool where it's very difficult to know what's actually true or not. But getting to the broader question about the analytical framework, it's very difficult. I think one thing that helps is precedent. I write a column for foreign policy every week, and one of my last column of last year was a sort of a look ahead for this coming year, what to expect. And as I was thinking about how to write that column, I was basically looking back on what happened last year. So, and really the last few years. And so, as we said, there was an uprising in Nepal that led to the ouster of the government in 2024. The same thing happened in Bangladesh. And those have now led to a situation where both countries will have elections early this coming year. Bangladesh has its elections in February, Nepal in March. So that was something I was thinking about. What's the best way to look at key events that have played out over the last year or two? And how could we look at trajectories for this coming year? Because these big events just don't go away, right? They continue to play out. And Bangladesh and Nepal are having these two very important political transitions. that are still very much in process. So that's one way that I look at it as well. But otherwise, I think as analysts, we have to be humble and accept that sometimes we just have to be reactive. We can't be thinking, okay, this is the type of thing that I need to be thinking about to look for. Sometimes it doesn't work that way because, to use your word again, it's chaotic. Things happen suddenly, and you just have to be ready for when something big takes place. One other comment I'll make is that even it's a very diverse, chaotic region, there certainly are a number of similarities and themes that sort of play out across the region. And one of those, I would argue, is contested, or not contested, in some cases contested, but fraught borders. So one thing that I always am tracking, this is just one example, uh, looking at something that plays out across the wider region, and that you have border issues in so many different cases. That's one way that I look at the region, seeing what types of new challenges these fraught borders could face, conflict risks, cross-border terrorism, territorial disputes. This all comes into play when it comes to borders in the region. So for me, sort of latching on to these evergreen themes that are common, and these themes are oftentimes not happy themes. They're not good. Trying to think about how that could all play out. That's another way that I look at the region as well.
Right. And, you mentioned elections that are going to happen this year, and there are two very important ones that both are happening after a period of unrest in which the government was overthrown. I do want to come to Bangladesh because that's something I've been following as well with a lot of interest, and that's happening, I believe, on February the 12th. But before that, I want to get into Nepal a little bit because we did an episode about Nepal, I think, about half a year ago, in which we were tracking the development of Hindutva politics. I think this was before the revolution or just before the protest started. And it was interesting to note a comment by, I believe, Biswas Baral, who was our guest at that point, that, the Nepalese youth are pretty frustrated with all the parties, all the three major parties, and they're looking for alternatives. And now that we're seeing this election coming up in Nepal, I think in the middle of next year, what is your overall view of how the different parties are going to, which party might emerge the strongest, and the changing, let's say, power of different factions within that election? So just give us a broad overview of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And to clarify, the elections are happening soon. They're happening in early March, so we're talking about this 2 months from now. So not much time, so to speak. And to its credit, the interim government, soon after it took office in September, it announced an election day right away, which is very different from what happened in the Bangladesh case. I would argue that we could see some more fireworks in some more turbulence in Nepal's politics because the protests in September were all about this idea of the not just the government in Nepal, but the broader political class being comprised of the same old suspects, the same old parties, the same old faces, and old in a literal sense, old people who are just so caught up in their own political battles that they don't care about what the public is dealing with and what the public needs. So it was very much a protest against, corruption and so on. But it was really this, I think, this reflection of, we're not going to take it anymore because we're sick and tired of, the same old folks that don't care about us. So I think that what many in Nepal are hoping for is an election that brings in new faces. But I think it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. I mean, you look at the various parties that are registered with the election commission in Nepal, and there are a number of new parties, including a few parties that were formed by those that were leaders of the September protests. But you know, given that we're talking about a process of just a few months, a period of just a few months, I think it will be very difficult for these new parties to be able to build up bases and resources to be able to be sufficiently electorally competitive that they could be in a position to take power or share power. I think it's quite likely that we're going to see one of the established parties come back to lead the country. I mean, they're the countries with the machines and the large bases and all of that. How will these angry young Nepalese that were out in force last year, how would they react to that? They may not react positively. So I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge. I do think one data point to note is that KP Sharma Ali, who of course was the most recent prime minister, he was the one that was ousted in September. He has agreed to participate in a government probe of the crackdown, the violent crackdown on the protesters. He had originally said he didn't recognize this commission; it was unconstitutional, it was biased. But he's agreed to cooperate with it, and he actually gave a statement to it the other day. The fact that he's willing to cooperate, I think, suggests perhaps that he at least acknowledges and understands how much anger there is, and that maybe he's not quite as out of touch as many of his critics think he is. So that's just a small data point, but trying to put a bit of a happy face on what I think is a fairly grim prognosis for Nepal's politics moving forward.
Hmm. And another important election that's going to happen is Bangladesh, which is, I think, happening within the next 2 months in February. And the run up to the election so far has been far from tranquil. I'm sure you've noted the post the assassination of Osman Hadi, we've seen some disturbing reports of political violence and even atrocities against minorities. And I wonder how concerned you are about the electoral process going on right now in Bangladesh, and how might that impact the acceptance and the legitimacy of the outcome?
Yeah, very true. I'm very concerned. I mean, I'm quite confident that the top leaders in Bangladesh, including Dr. Yunus and others, the various advisors in the interim government, they're committed to seeing the election take place. The election commission fully on board. The key stakeholders, the military, others they want the election to be free, fair, credible, peaceful, and so on. But I think there's a significant risk of spoilers, meaning that the risks of violence are very high. The Awami League has been banned from conducting political activities, which means maybe it doesn't literally mean that it can't participate in the election, but in practice it can, because if you can't conduct political activities, you can't campaign and so on. So for all this talk about how this could be the first truly credible election in Bangladesh in years, I mean, one of the major parties is not going to be a part of it. And I think that's pretty significant. There are plenty of folks in Bangladesh, I would say maybe even a significant majority, that don't want the Awami League to be in the election, given what happened during Sheikh Hasina's final days with the horrific levels of brutalities and the fact that neither Sheikh Hasina nor her son and other prominent leaders of the party have even been willing to acknowledge these brutalities. But the Awami League's not going to be in the election. I do fear that Awami League partisans and supporters could try to disrupt the campaign with violence. Um, Sajid Wazid, Sheikh Hasina's son, gave what I found to be a very disturbing interview to Reuters a few weeks ago, and he basically said, "We're going to try to disrupt." Those weren't his exact words, but he said, "If the ban on political activities isn't going to be removed, watch out." Very concerning. I mean, weren't his exact words, but that was his suggestion. And then on the other end of the political spectrum are the religious hardliners, who clearly have an interest in causing disruptions. And of course, we saw. I mean, you mentioned the assassination of or the shooting of Osman Hadi, who died several days after he was shot. We had a mob of folks, of religious hardliners, that set fire to the offices of two distinguished, prestigious newspapers in Bangladesh. And indeed, I mean, I think India might exaggerate the extent to what this happens, but yes, I mean, we have seen religious minorities in Bangladesh, particularly Hindus, but also Christians to an extent as well, experiencing threats and in some cases violence from Islamist hardliners. There's a particularly horrific case a few weeks ago where a young Bangladesh Hindu garment worker was lynched and was killed. This is terrible, and this is not what you want to see. I mean, you never want to see this, but especially as we come to the election period, it's not a good thing. And another reason to be concerned is that the police in Bangladesh, I would argue, have been experiencing significantly bad morale ever since the mass uprising in 2024. I mean, the police were on the front lines of this horrific crackdown. There's still a lot of anger and rage harbored toward the police by many in Bangladesh. My understanding, at least in Dhaka, is you still don't have the police back out deployed at full force, at full strength. There's still many that refuse to work. There have been some significant, some good media reportage about how this is impacting the capacity of the police to respond to law and order problems. So this suggests to me that if there is violence, election-related violence, the police might not be able to respond in ways that one would hope for to get it back, to get it to manageable levels or to end it. The military in Bangladesh, very complex situation. It doesn't want to be seen on the front lines of being a security guarantor or provider. I think it also worries about what happened during the mass uprising. So, yeah, the question is there's risks of violence, but there's also risks that the state will struggle to get it back down if it breaks out. So I think that when you talk about the election process, the biggest concern for me is that violence could disrupt it to the point that it's difficult for campaigning to happen on a level it should, and also that it could affect turnout. And so, if these two things happen, if campaigning is constrained, if political figures can't be campaigning, if people are too afraid to go vote on election day, I think that's going to make it very easy to argue that the election is not a credible one. Hopefully, it's not that bad, but there is a very real risk that these things could happen.
Right. And I do want to ask a question about the information environment, because as you mentioned, a lot of the news coming out of Bangladesh, sometimes does come from Indian sources who tend to have let's say, a tendency to exaggerate or create patterns that may or may not reflect the exact situation on the ground. I mean, let's say with the murder of, I believe, Deepu Chandra Das was pretty horrific. But there've been other attacks on minorities, and sometimes it's difficult to tell whether, for instance, as is claimed by certain Indian sources, that these are, targeted killings, or as a result of, a more hard-led religious approach towards Bangladesh, or as some Bangladesh authorities claim, that these are local issues, or these may be people associated with certain parties, and, these shouldn't be interpreted on a broader scale. I mean, where do you fall on that sort of axis of opinions, let's say? Are these, indicative of a changing environment, or are these local issues that might be exaggerated by certain, let's say, biased sources?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the biggest cases of misinformation and disinformation played out very soon after the mass movement. When Sheikh Hasina had just been ousted and an interim government came into play, there was all this reportage and social media commentary about uh, the Hindu minority in Bangladesh facing pogrom and these horrific levels of violence. That was an exaggeration. To qualify, there were cases of minorities being targeted, and there was violence. There were killings, but it was exaggerated on two levels. One, the amount. I mean, there was not a pogrom, there was not a genocide, nothing like that. And the other case is that this was essentially politically motivated violence, in the sense that it's well known in Bangladesh that the Hindu community in Bangladesh had tended to be strong supporters of Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League Party. And so, those that were attacking or threatening them, it was because of their political allegiances. It was not because they were Hindus per se. I mean, that could have been the case in some isolated cases, but generally speaking, this was politically motivated violence. So there was that. Um, I do think that as the law and order situation has become more precarious over the last year in Bangladesh, and as the major political changes played out in Bangladesh that allowed for more space for hardline Islamist religious actors to be present and active, this has made some religious minority communities feel more uh, afraid for their security. And, when you had that incident, that horrific tragedy that you just mentioned play out, obviously this is going to amplify the fears that religious minority communities feel. So I think that, there certainly is a reason to be concerned, but I don't think we should overstate just how much this has become an issue. But, what I like to say when it comes to this disinformation or misinformation thing, you have the risk of the boy who cried wolf effect, right? When you have for so long, when you have exaggerations or outright lies about what's happening, then when you actually have terrible things happen, I mean, if there were to be a significant upsurge in threats or violence to the Bangladesh minority community in the Bangladesh Hindu, the Hindu minority community in Bangladesh, the risk is that if this actually happens, a lot of people won't believe it if they've known that for so often these allegations are not true. So this is why I think that those that carry out these disinformation campaigns, they're really shooting themselves in the foot, because they're setting themselves up for a situation where down the road, if the things that they claim are happening that weren't, actually start happening, they're not going to get a critical mass of people to believe them. This happened in Afghanistan after the Taliban came back as well. All these exaggerated claims about the horrible things the Taliban were doing. They were doing some horrible things, but not as many as what the disinformation purveyors were suggesting. And it's like the risk is, okay, what if the Taliban really do start reverting to their worst excesses of the '90s and all that? So anyway, it's complex, but bottom line is that there's reason to be concerned, but I think it's important, and this is where social media literacy becomes important, knowing when to trust your sources, especially in social media, and knowing that so much of what you're seeing is oftentimes unverified or outright false.
Right. And one final question about Bangladesh. I think one of the more interesting developments that happened is that the ostensibly secular NCP, which is the party of the students, or the party that emerged out of the students who led the 2024 uprising against Sheikh Hasina, entering into an alliance with the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is a Islamist party. How do you view this new Jamaat NCP? I think the LDP is also part of this new alliance. Is it a united opposition, perhaps an Islamist opposition, or is it a more contradictory coalition of convenience? And that significant question that I think everyone's asking, will it be able to attract former Awami League voters and actually pose a challenge to the BNP's electoral prospects, or has this essentially sealed the deal for the BNP where the Awami League voters would rather go vote for them than the Jamaat, for instance?
Yeah, it is an interesting new alliance. I would actually argue if there's any established party that the NCP would be most likely to link up with, it would be Jamaat. You're right. I mean, NCP is ostensibly secular, but I would argue that there are a number of the student leaders who ideologically had views that converge with Jamaat and other religious parties. I think that's quite clear. So in that sense, it's not too much of a surprise. I don't think it's a coalition of convenience. I think that it makes sense from the students' perspective. What is a bit interesting is that, the student leaders had said they wanted, fresh start, blank slate, new faces, and so on. And Jamaat is not, they're not new faces. It's not clean slate. Jamaat has been around for a long time. But again, it's not that surprising. And also, I mean, as Jamaat has long projected itself as clean, as not corrupt, like the dynastic parties, and I think that's important for the student leaders because one of the many grievances that was harbored and played out, with the protest was this idea of the Awami League being so incredibly corrupt. So I think that there might be some sympathies from the NCP toward the Jamaat for that reason. I think that it would be difficult to expect that this new coalition would attract former Hasina voters. I mean, Hasina voters, I think, I would assume, given that they supported Hasina, would not support the ideologies and the parties that she claimed to oppose so rigorously. And of course, Hasina's policies entailed cracking down about as viciously as possible on Jamaat. And one would argue that many of the members of the Awami League's base, I don't want to call them secular, but they're definitely not Islamist in a broad sense. So I think that might keep Hasina voters from wanting to go for this new alliance. This is a very big and interesting question. I can't imagine hardcore Hasina voters opting for any of the main options, whether you're talking about BNP or BNP electoral alliance or this new Jamaat NCP LDP alliance. I think they only want to see their party represented. And this gets back to the violence risk, right? I mean, if a critical mass of Awami League supporters don't see electoral candidates they'd be comfortable with, that's when you have to worry about increased risks of spoiler activities, including violence.
It's interesting because it reminds me of I'm from the city of Bombay in Maharashtra in India right now, and like there was always this interesting development that happened a few election cycles ago where Muslim voters who voted for the Congress and who have a very bad history with the local party called Shiv Sena actually did start voting for the Shiv Sena because they had a greater grievance against the BJP. Um, Elections in South Asia are a very funny thing, and these coalitions are fascinating. But I think a lot will come out after the election to see assuming it's fair and transparent, and it's carried out with some integrity. But moving on from Bangladesh to the India Pakistan war that happened earlier, um, I think the conflict that followed Pahalgam, it marks the most significant escalation of hostilities in at least a quarter century, since Kargil, and possibly since 1971, as you mentioned. And in retrospect, after, let's say, we've had some distance from that event, who do you think emerged strategically better positioned after the conflict? I think you mentioned that Pakistan at least has a projected victory domestically, but what were the wins and the losses after Pahalgam for both sides? And more importantly, what lessons do you think that both sides took away from the conflict in terms of strategic, tactical, and diplomatic capabilities and effectiveness?
Yeah, great question. Again, I think this is the central issue of last year in South Asia, this conflict. It's so rare for nuclear armed states to fight each other. India and Pakistan have done it several times in recent years, and none more aggressively than in this conflict last year. Very concerning. Um, yeah, I mean, I do think strongly this was the most significant escalation of hostility since 71, not since Cargill. And I say that because Cargill, this of course was this limited war in 91. It lasted significantly longer than the 4-day war in May, or 3 days, or whatever it was, but it was very geographically limited, right? It was not, sorry, I said 91, 99. It was geographically limited to Cargill itself, whereas this conflict that played out in May of last year, you're talking about drones and missiles being fired across each country's border deep into the other's territory. That's why I think it's the most significant since 71. So in terms of who emerged strategically better positioned, the winners and losers, my view, generally speaking, is that it was a draw. I mean, each side got its hits in, each side achieved what it wanted to do. But I think that at the end of the day, Pakistan was the bigger winner, just because I think that there was a pretty strong expectation in India that it would have been able to do more than it actually did. And particularly if you look at what happened, I mean, this very controversial issue of Indian jets being downed. India's government has still not definitively acknowledged that any of its jets were shot down. But there's a strong amount of evidence to indicate that we don't know how many, several Indian jets were shot down by the Pakistani Air Force. And, of course, this is the main narrative that the Pakistani state has used to declare a Pakistani victory over India. And again, not just the state, but members of the Pakistani public, including those that in some cases are very critical of the Pakistani state. Even the ex account of Imran Khan was praising Pakistan, or calling for supporting Pakistan's military during this conflict. A big part of that, obviously, enmity toward India, but also the say that Pakistan was able to hold its own, and I think that's true. And the fact that Pakistan was able to hold its own in the face of an Indian army that's much larger and one could argue much better resourced than Pakistan's, I think that's pretty significant. And then if you also look at what I would describe, sort of narratives that play out away from the battlefield, Pakistan won the battle narratives in a landslide, right? India wanted the world to see this conflict as a case of India launching strikes in Pakistan in retaliation for this horrific Pahalgam attack in Kashmir that India claimed Pakistan was behind. And India wanted the world to sit back, support that position, understand that India has counterterrorism imperatives. It's going to go after these terrorists in Pakistan. And why shouldn't the world just accept that? Because the world supports any effort to go after terrorists. That's what India wanted, but that didn't happen, right? Instead, the international community very quickly called for de-escalation, for the two sides to work things out. You had mediation efforts by the U.S. and some others. So why was that, right? Why did the world not just sort of sit back and say, okay, India's got to do what it has to do? Two reasons. One, India never provided public evidence linking Pakistan to the Pahalgam attack. That's the first thing. I mean, there has been a very in-depth investigation that was released the very end of the year that pointed to the involvement of some Pakistan sponsored terrorists. That was not information that was provided but right before India started launching strikes in Pakistan. So that's one thing. The other thing is that these are two nuclear armed states, and the international community understandably worries about nuclear escalation risks, and so understandably would have a strong interest in seeing hostilities end as soon as they start. And that's why you didn't have this view of, okay, this can play out. We're going to sort of stay out. We're not going to get involved. There's a very serious fear about nuclear escalation, particularly because you had the most intense levels of hostilities used since that played out since 71. So basically, so Pakistan, I think, was able to more conclusively declare victory in the sense that it was able to hold its own against a more powerful, more well-resourced military, and also it was able to win the battle of narratives. Not that India didn't achieve things, right? I mean, India it was able to target some very strategic, sensitive targets, Pakistani military targets. That's a pretty big deal from India's perspective. But still, I think that Pakistan had the upper hand, broadly speaking. Now, in terms of lessons for that both sides took away, I think that unfortunately they were the wrong lessons. I think that the lessons that were taken away were that each side can comfortably engage in conventional warfare against each other without having to worry about nuclear escalation risks. I do think that's the view. If you look at the trajectory of hostilities between India and Pakistan over the course of these three recent conflicts, the one last year, a brief one in 2019, another brief one in 2016, in each case, you have successively greater levels of hostilities used. And I think that both sides conclude that, okay, we're comfortable. We could get our hits in. We don't have to worry about nuclear escalation risks. We're mature, we're mature countries, we're mature militaries. At the end of the day, it's going to be fine. But one could also look at this as a case of, okay, I mean, as you go further up the continuum, as you have more intense hostilities playing out, you get closer and closer to bumping up against the nuclear threshold. And that's when you really have to worry. And this is what the international community was so concerned about. And this is actually, it's a sensitive issue because this is one rare thing India and Pakistan agree on, that why is the international community worried about nuclear war? It's not going to happen. We know that we're not going to let things get to that point. But I think that's not how the international community sees things. And so, this is why, this is why I think that the wrong lessons were drawn from both Indian and Pakistani policymakers. And, I guess that one could argue another way that Pakistan benefits is that, with the world moving in quickly to call for an end to hostilities and for mediation, Pakistan hopes that that'll entail the world wanting to take a bigger focus on this India-Pakistan dispute, and maybe wanting to push the two sides to sit down and talk about Kashmir, about India-administered Kashmir. India doesn't want that. Kashmir is off the table from India's perspective, India-administered Kashmir. But, I mean, that hasn't happened either. But bottom line, I think the wrong lessons were drawn. Very concerning.
I really enjoy that because it does paint a rather almost sibling-like relationship between India and Pakistan, where you engage in fights constantly, but you sort of understand your own dynamic, and you get concerned when other people start worrying about it. But the fact stays that they both have nuclear weapons, and certainly one of the interesting things that happened when, as you mentioned, General Asim Munir, now Field Marshal Asim Munir, ascended to the top of the Pakistan military was, I suspect he is a lot more, at least outwardly aggressive towards India, at least in terms of his comments before and after the Pahalgam attack, his approach, his consolidation of power. And I wonder if you think that this suggests that we'll see a more hardline and aggressive approach towards India in the next few years or over 2026 that diverged from what I would say was the more muted approach favored by his predecessor, General Bajwa. What might we expect in the India-Pakistan relationship over the next years as a result of what I would call this new Munir doctrine, if such exists?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Maybe I'd push back again. I mean, I think one could argue that there's a Munir doctrine, but I think it relates more to domestic issues in Pakistan than to relations with India. I think it relates more to this idea that the military can and should be very openly and explicitly involved in as many aspects of policy and politics as possible, not to worry about that. Um, but uh, I would argue that most, if not all, Pakistani army chiefs need to be um, need to take a hard line, an aggressive approach toward India, because at the end of the day, the legitimacy of the military and the justification that the military has put out there for why it has to be such a prominent political actor relates to India, right? This idea that the military needs to protect Pakistan from India because India is a threat, an existential threat, a term that we used to see from many in Pakistan. And if you were to have an army chief that were to sort of pull back and call for better relations and much less pursue peace with India, that could, I think, undercut poor source of legitimacy for the Pakistani military. If there's no more India threat, well, then what reason do you have to be outside of the barracks anymore? So there's that. You're right. I mean, we did hear some particularly aggressive rhetoric from Munir. I think part of that relates to the conflict, the crisis, and the conflict itself. And I think that the fact that India did carry out significant levels of force in Pakistan is something that was very upsetting for the army chief, just on a very personal level. And if I mean, there's still a lot of unknowns here. If it's true that Pakistan had no involvement in the Pahalgam attack, and yet India accused Pakistan of being involved and then carried out strikes, military strikes in Pakistan that, according to Pakistani officials, killed civilians. There'd be anger, genuine anger from the army chief about that as well. But I think broadly speaking, his rhetoric, Munir's rhetoric, and quite frankly, his policies toward India don't strike me as any more hardline or aggressive than his predecessors. I mean, this idea of being and also, I mean, I should say that, there's even been, I mean, I haven't heard as much of this recently, but I don't think that Munir has closed off the possibility of dialogue with India down the road. If there's an opportunity to talk about Kashmir, which there won't be that opportunity anytime soon. So I think there's that as well. But, turning to the question of what we can expect from India-Pakistan relations, given the Munir factor, I think it might be better to look at this through the lens of Modi than Munir. I would argue that if any new doctrine came out of this conflict, it was a Modi doctrine, right? He gave a speech after the ceasefire was announced in which he set out a number of new red lines, which are pretty significant. He basically said, among other things, he said any terrorist attack in India would be an act of war, would be seen as an act of war, which suggests that India is ready to retaliate against Pakistan for any act of terrorism. He also said that India would not distinguish between the terrorists and their sponsors, which suggests if there's a terrorist attack in India, India could retaliate by immediately targeting Pakistani military targets in Pakistan. So this suggests that India, which has taken a very hard line toward Pakistan ever since Modi went to Lahore early on in his very first term, and then came back to India and there was a terrorist attack carried out by a Pakistan-sponsored group. Ever since then, India's taken a very hard line toward Pakistan, but we've seen an increase in that hard line given that speech, and also, after a number of things that India did after the conflict, like holding in abeyance the Indus Waters Treaty, which has never been done before, closing down all the borders, all trade between India and Pakistan. So I think that because of the Modi factor, I'm even more skeptical about India-Pakistan relations than I typically am. And if you look at the pattern of, if you look at history, if you look at historical patterns in India-Pakistan relations, after wars and after serious crises, you do tend to see a bounce back where the two sides, agree to pick up trade and to do more things on a modest level. I don't think it's going to happen this time for the reasons I mentioned, the Modi doctrine, the fact that there were so many punitive steps taken by India beyond military steps. And I just don't think that, India has any interest in talking to Pakistan. I hope that this year will be one where the best case scenario would be a really frozen relationship. Worst case scenario is a trigger. that could lead to a resumption of the conflict. Because that's another thing. The speech that Modi made after the ceasefire suggested that, he didn't necessarily think the conflict was over. Um, and Indian officials don't even use the term ceasefire, right? So I think that it's a very precarious moment for this relationship, and I hope that we don't see another conflict this year.
So, Michael, speaking of Pakistan's, foreign policy, I think, as you mentioned, last year saw a string of diplomatic successes for Pakistan, from its, projected victory in its India conflict, a seemingly better relationship with the Trump administration, a formal alliance with Saudi Arabia, and now perhaps a greater role in Middle East security, as I believe Pakistan troops are supposed to be part of the contingent that maintains peace in Gaza, although I'm not sure what developments on that front have been. But how do you view Pakistan's, what I would call its reinvigorated foreign policy last year? Should we take Pakistan more seriously now over 2026 in terms of its power projection and its role in regional security, or do you think these are more show than substance?
Yeah, I think that this Pakistan really has benefited from the current geopolitical moment. And yes, I mean it has been increasingly prominent on the world stage the last year. But I don't. I mean, no offense to Pakistan. I think this is less because of. Sorry, this is more because of geopolitical circumstances than by efforts that Pakistan itself has made. So I think that this idea of a reinvigorated foreign policy is a bit of a mirage. I think that Pakistan has been able to very effectively project itself as an important strategic actor vis-a-vis the Middle East, given everything that's been playing out there the last year. Pakistan, of course, geographically is situated adjacent to the Middle East, bordering Iran. Pakistan has very strong ties with the GCC states, and it has friendly relations with Iran as well, which helps, even though, of course, it fought a brief conflict with Iran 2 years ago. But generally speaking, it's got a friendly relationship with Iran. And I think that's something that the Trump administration and other key capitals have noticed. And of course, Pakistan's um, mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia during the latter part of last year, I think, sort of, you know, brought more attention to Pakistan's significance in the Middle East. And, one could argue it's become a net security provider in the Middle East for that reason. But, um, if things calm down in the Middle East, I certainly hope they do. Um, if the Trump administration and other key capitals in the West start investing less policy space in the Middle East, if things calm down, I think that would then mean that Pakistan's strategic utility vis-a-vis the Middle East would simply recede. Um, and then coming to the issue of the Trump administration's relationship with Pakistan, I think that's something that we have to be very careful about evaluating as well. It's a very volatile, a very notoriously mercurial president who now sees business opportunities in Pakistan, critical minerals, cryptocurrency, and others. But a lot of challenges and question marks attached to those opportunities. And if the president concludes that maybe it's just too much and it's not worth it, he could lose patience and lose interest in Pakistan. So my point is that the geopolitical circumstances that have enabled Pakistan to become more prominent on the global stage could change very quickly, meaning that Pakistan's prominence would recede. And at the end of the day, Pakistan is obviously a very important country. Its geographic location is very significant, but at the end of the day, it doesn't have as nearly as much to offer to the world as India does, as many other countries do in the Indo-Pacific and Asia. I think that Pakistan would have to develop into a much stronger and sustained economically strong country to be able to offer anything more to the world. Pakistan for some years has been trying to um, engineer a major shift in its foreign policy into one that focuses less on geopolitics and more on pursuing connectivity and trade links with its neighbors in South and Central Asia. I think that's a terrific idea. I think it should do that. I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think there's opportunities for it to work more closely with other countries in the region, including Bangladesh. There's a new opening there that happened with the political changes in Bangladesh. If they could talk more about shared challenges, shared development challenges, climate change, that type of thing, that's great. But globally, as the idea of Pakistan being able to sustain itself as a critical global actor, I think that's just a bigger challenge. I mean, I'm talking relative to other countries, India and others in the region.
Right. And as we, even as you talk about Pakistan's foreign policy, I do wonder about the domestic situation because it seems like the domestic situation in Pakistan, at least west of the Indus, has continued to deteriorate, even as Munir consolidates his hold over the civilian government in the heartland area of Punjab and Sindh. With the below insurgency and the TTP Taliban Afghanistan conflict continuing to present major security risks, I wonder how you see Pakistan's domestic security and stability evolve through 2026. Will the establishment continue to, maintain its grip over domestic politics, or do you think there are threats in the wings apart from the conflict issues? I'm thinking of Imran Khan. I'm thinking of the Tehrik-e-Labbaik that might pose a challenge to Buddhist supremacy and the establishment's supremacy.
Yeah, let me answer the second part of the question first. I don't think there's any imminent threats to the establishment's grip over domestic politics. I think that the leadership has the PTI where it wants it. PTI, of course, is the main opposition party, the party of Imran Khan. It's been completely sidelined. And this is because of the heightened repression in Pakistan over the last few years. Imran Khan is in jail. Yes, I mean, there's content posted on his social media accounts, which continue to, to embolden his large support base. But he's in jail. I mean, he's got all these charges against him. He just got another a conviction a few weeks ago. I mean, one could argue that these are politically manufactured, but he's in jail for a number of years, at least for now. So I think that the establishment has Khan and his party where it wants it. Another issue, the thing about PTI is the party revolved around Khan and his cult of personality. Now that he's out of the picture politically, what's left of the party and its leadership has really not been able to salvage the party's strength. The party has been a bit of a mess. So there's differences in views between the different leaders. That all benefits the establishment as well because it makes the party less of a threat. TLP, of course, this is one of the hardline religious parties that's able to mobilize in a big way. Yeah, I mean, this is something that worries the establishment, but TLP has been banned by the establishment. Security forces cracked down really hard on one of the most recent TLP protests, which is pretty significant, given that in Pakistan, oftentimes the establishment tries to, keep these religious actors at an arm's length for fear of antagonizing them and leading to further violence or the risk of that. So I think that the establishment feels it has the TLP in its ilk in where it wants them as well. But I would say that the risk here is that for now, I mean, the establishment has things where it wants them. It doesn't face imminent threats to its dominance, but you have a very dangerous long-term social dynamic playing out where you have large numbers of Pakistanis, certainly PTI, Imran Khan supporters, but others who are very angry about the current state of play, who are very angry about the high levels of repression, angry about just how powerful the military and Asim Munir have become, angry that an unelected individual like Asim Munir could have this level of power. Um, and yet they can't peacefully channel these grievances because you can't just take to the streets and protest against the government peacefully because of the repression. That, I think, over the longer term, that bottled up sentiment, I think, is very concerning. Pakistan is not the kind of country where you could expect there to be mass protests like we saw in Nepal last year, or Bangladesh the year before that, Sri Lanka several years ago, and other countries around the world, because the military is so powerful that it would preempt any type of thing like that. That's my view. Getting to the issue of the security and stability situation this year, very concerning. I mean, we know that Pakistan's biggest security threat is cross-border terrorism emanating from Afghanistan, given that the Taliban there have been able to provide shelter to their close ally, the Pakistani Taliban. And Pakistan does not appear to have a solution to this problem. It's been unable to get the Taliban to address Pakistan's TTP concerns. And I would argue, and I'm actually going to be writing something about this soon, we talk about the risk of another India-Pakistan conflict. There's a risk that there could be some type of conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan this year. We saw last year at times, toward the end of the year, Pakistan carried out military strikes in Afghanistan, which it claimed were targeting TTP bases. The Taliban then retaliated with attacks on Pakistani border posts. Yeah, I think that if this plays out again, I mean, if we continue to see these upsurges in TTP terrorism in Pakistan, Pakistan could decide again to resort to military strikes in Afghanistan, and if they're robust, if they carry out far beyond the border, if civilians are killed, if they're sustained, that could compel conceivably the Taliban to leverage its capacity to draw on radicals, not just TTP, but others, and basically encourage them to carry out terrorist attacks across Pakistan. Very dangerous. I mean, there have been talks that have played out in recent months, brokered by Turkey and Qatar between the Taliban and Pakistan to try to reduce tensions and try to address this issue. They haven't worked. I think there are also talks that Saudi Arabia quietly brokered at the end of last year. No, the only thing that was agreed on was to maintain a ceasefire, which is good, but no agreement on dealing with the TTP issue. So I think, yeah, Pakistan, it really does face this terrorism issue. You mentioned the Baluch insurgency. Absolutely, that continues to fester. And with all this talk of the U.S. trying to look into possible investment opportunities in critical minerals, large number of those critical minerals are in Baluchistan. The Baluch insurgency is driven in great part by this, rooted in this grievance of exploitation of its resources by the Pakistani state and outsiders like China. I don't think the BLA, the Baluch insurgents, would be particularly sympathetic to American investors trying to set up shop to excavate critical minerals, mining activities. So yeah, this is a very serious matter for Pakistan for sure.
Now, coming to a favorite bugbear of mine, which is the India-U.S. relationship that happened last year. There was a surprising downturn. We've covered this over several episodes, and I wonder now, looking into 2026, as we have a better idea of President Trump's foreign policy, do you see this downturn as a short-term hurdle, or do you think it's indicative of a longer-term rethink of the partnership on either side? Is the Trump administration pursuing a strategic doctrine that effectively sidelines India? And is there any timeline when the US and India might come to a trade agreement that reduces the punitive tariffs and sanctions? We've seen recently there's a bill that was passed by Senator Lindsey Graham, I believe, that could result in up to 500% tariffs for India. I wonder if there's any progress going to be made on those sanctions and tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complex issue, and I think that there's a tendency for some analysts to say, well, this U.S. India relationship had been so strong for many years, so multifaceted, so deep rooted, it'll bounce back eventually. But the more things play out, the more skeptical we have to be about that view. I think that a trade deal would be a critical confidence building measure that would help the relationship get back on track more broadly. But the fact that for so long they've been talking and they've been saying, both sides have been saying we're close, there's still no deal is concerning. And as you note, there's now, a new legislation with bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress that calls for even greater, that would call for things that could lead to even higher tariffs on India, given what it's doing with Russia. This is, I think, very concerning, and it might make India less inclined to want to talk to the U.S. anymore. We heard Howard Lubnick just recently do an interview. Is of course the Treasury um, Secretary, um, say that, well, he basically blamed Modi. He said Modi wouldn't call the president. That's why there's no deal. That's probably not what the Indians wanted to hear, and I'm sure that might well not be true. But my point is that they've been talking for so long. And when Modi was at the White House almost a year ago, during the beginning of the second Trump term, Modi and Trump issued a joint statement laying out all kinds of things they'd be working on and pursuing. And it included, reaching a trade deal. And one had thought that back then it would have been very easy because the tensions hadn't set into the relationship yet. But, they both committed to doing it. And yet it seems to become increasingly difficult. And another reason why this new legislation, I think, could be particularly demoralizing for the trade talks is that my sense is that India had fulfilled or had addressed the demands that the U.S. side had of India when it came to the Russia factor. India had agreed to and actually had started reducing its oil imports from Russia in late November after the new U.S. sanctions in Russia went into effect. So I think India felt that it had that covered. But now for there to be the chance of new legislation that could lead to fresh tariffs on India for its commercial ties with Russia, very, very demoralizing. So I don't think that the Trump administration genuinely wants to lose India. Um, but I would say that there's a strong difference, a strong disconnect between what the White House wants to do or how the White House views India and how the rest of the US government views India. I mean, the White House is comprised of folks that in many cases are business leaders, not well versed in geopolitics, may not understand US India relations in a big way. The NSC has been cut down significantly. You have a few, you do have folks looking over India at the NSC, but not too many of them. And I think that there's a view in the White House that, it's all about trade and commercial relations and, addressing that trade deficit with India. And so that means that, the US has to do whatever is possible, whatever is necessary to ensure that India's policies change in a way that US economic interests are no longer harmed. And then gets to this fixation on the tariff issue and the trade deficit. Likewise, the White House really wants a peace deal uh, between Russia and Ukraine, and so it's going to keep putting pressure on countries like India that do a lot of business with Russia, and particularly a country like India, which has indeed, as the administration has said, significantly ramped up its imports of oil from Russia since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. China might import more oil from Russia, but India has increased its imports from Russia at a higher rate than China has. So, but the State Department, DoD, I would argue that significant, like the Washington policy bureaucracy, so to speak, they've got a lot of experts there, more context, and a view that whoa, we need to pull back here and make sure that we don't lose control of this relationship altogether. And it's easy to overlook given, all the headlines made by the tariffs and all that. There actually were a lot of achievements for US India cooperation last year. Two sides had launched a joint satellite. There were a series of military exercises. The FBI coordinated with India to arrest several individuals that India views as Khalistan terrorists. So there are a number of things that happened, which suggest to me that the bureaucracy continues to function, and the policy community is still very much wanting to work with India. The question is whether the U.S. India relationship, which in Washington is now driven by the White House, if that could change so that you have more senior officials at state and DoD, in other words, other places, able to drive their relationship more. Because if that happens, I think there's more of a chance that we could see some degree of stabilization. If the White House continues to drive the relationship, I'm very skeptical that things are going to change before the end of the Trump administration. Um, and final point: Trump needs to go to India, right? Theoretically, there's supposed to be a Quad leader summit. It was supposed to happen last year. It didn't happen because of U.S.-India tensions. It's supposed to happen this year. I think that if Trump goes to India for the Quad summit, that would be a big boost for the relationship. I think he's most likely to go if he has a trade deal to announce. So these things are all linked. But yeah, I think that it's just going to be very difficult to move the relationship forward if the White House continues to drive it. I was in Delhi a few weeks ago. I heard what I thought I would hear. A lot of trust has been squandered in New Delhi because of the actions and the rhetoric of the Trump of the White House.
Yeah, but to speak realistically, Michael, about the US India partnership from the India side, I mean, what strategies can India honestly pursue to mitigate this downturn in the US partnership? We're seeing a flurry of trade agreements with different countries like the EU, New Zealand, UK, many more coming up. But do these translate into viable alternatives to the trade with America? And in any case, what are India's strategic alternatives to the US partnership? Is detente with China doubling down on the Russia relationship, or the so-called multi-alignment policy really practical in the current geopolitical environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to replace. Well, let me put it this way: India has been pursuing a series of workarounds to try to ensure that it can compensate for the loss of the potential loss of American markets if these high tariffs continue to be placed on Indian goods. Indeed, as you note, it's India's getting close to an agreement with the EU. India has completed several trade agreements, including a few FTAs in recent years. I mean, India is not the protectionist country that it used to be. It very robustly pursues trade deals now. Getting a deal with the EU would be especially significant because that's really the other top export market for India beyond the U.S. But even with all that, I mean, given the huge market that the U.S. provides, I think it's going to be tough. It would be tough for India to recover if there's an extended period of 50% tariffs that it faces with the U.S. And it has sought to try to expand its already sizable commercial ties with China. Despite the India-China rivalry, it's a pretty close commercial relationship. And I think there are indications that India is going to perhaps reduce some of the scrutiny on new Chinese investment, new Chinese FDI. These are measures put into place after the India-China border clash in 2020, which led to a lot of serious tensions. But still, even with that, it's very hard to just let the U.S. market go. So that'll be tough. And in terms of strategic alternatives, very difficult. Yes, India is trying to ease tensions with China, but it's not a full-scale detente. They remain bitter competitors and rivals because of their disputed border, because of China's relationship with Pakistan, because of so many other things. Um, so I think that India would recognize that it really needs to continue to work with the U.S. on strategic levels to counter Chinese power. And India might say, "Oh, well, we don't need U.S. help. This is not an alliance. We can manage the China issue." But let's be very clear. I mean, the U.S. in recent years has supplied a lot of critical intelligence to India that's very on a very direct level helped it deter um, potential Chinese provocations on the border. So that's just one example right there. So I think that this is all to say that even with the squandered trust and all of that, I think that India really wants this relationship with the U.S. to get back on track. And I think that it concludes that it can play a waiting game. Worst comes to worst, it has to wait 3 years until there's a new government in the U.S., which I think we could safely argue, regardless of who's leading it, even like a JD Vance, for example, I don't think that I think that whatever government comes to power after Trump will want to get this relationship with India back on track if it's not back on track by then.
Right. And yeah, my final two questions have to do more with the idea of these global disruptions that we've seen over the past year and how they might translate to South Asia regional policy over 2026. Um, Firstly, the global disruptions in not just international trade, but in many of the post-war economic, institutional, and security frameworks, with the U.S. traditionally guaranteeing these frameworks, looking very uncertain, or at least shaky, and with many of the South Asian countries reliant on these frameworks for their economic and developmental models. When you talk about investment or for IMF bailouts or for export markets, how do you think these global disruptions might impact the region's economic prospects and developmental models? And how do you think these countries might adapt to these changes in the long run?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's not just the issue of the uncertainty of the U.S. role as the guarantor of this global order, but also this new threat posed by U.S. aggression. Right? I mean, I think that South Asian countries, like so many countries, were really shaken by the U.S. operation in Venezuela recently, and by the threats coming from the U.S. to other countries in that region. Central South America is very far from South Asia, but I think it sort of reinforces this idea that we're looking with an incredibly, to put it mildly, unconventional administration in Washington, and what that can mean for us, meaning the South Asian states. Definitely going to be a big question on the mind of the region's capitals throughout this coming year. Um, so I think that it does all come back to the issue of commercial stuff and trade, because I said before that 4 of the 8 South Asian countries were hit by high tariffs, and they're still trying to bring those down. And yeah, I think that they're going to have to not only continue to focus on that, but look at how the region could try to prepare for a world in which they can no longer rely on the U.S. to provide the type of support that might have come earlier. And this gets to another important issue, the fact that the Trump administration has essentially dismantled the entire U.S. development and foreign assistance structure. It's completely gone. Many South Asian countries had been quite reliant on U.S. support: Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, a number of Sri Lanka, a number of others. This is something that these countries will have to grapple with. But I think that the region will want to fall back on something that one of the few things that brings the region together, and that's the non-aligned policy. That the non-alignment that this region's governments have always taken to foreign policy. This idea of not putting all your eggs in one superpower basket, but more so balance your relations with as many countries as you can. Obviously, India and Pakistan, this is a different story, but the smaller countries in South Asia, the relatively smaller countries in South Asia, this is something that they, I think, will want to double down on in terms of ensuring that they maintain their good relations with China, with key middle powers elsewhere, whether you're talking about the Middle East, the key oil exporting states in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. And I think as well, it could prompt these countries in South Asia to ensure that they uh, build on and expand their relations with other countries in the global South. One of the reasons why BRICS has become uh, more of a big thing lately is that it's been able to capitalize on the anger that so many countries in the global South have about the U.S. led order and U.S. policy and so on. And and many countries want to be a part of BRICS because BRICS is viewed as something that's meant to pose as an alternative to the U.S. Western-led model. BRICS is more of a talk shop than anything else to this point, but it might be able to do more if it has more commitments from more countries and so on. So, but basically, I think that South Asian countries will need to respond by doubling down on these non-aligned policies, but also perhaps looking at this as an opportunity to deepen ties with their fellow global South states, most of which share their South Asian countries' concerns about these major disruptions in the world order and the uncertainty of the U.S. leadership in it.
Fantastic. So, a year that is maybe a bit concerning, perhaps, in terms of your outlook, but also a few spots of hope. Let's see how this entire situation evolves. And I think you mentioned Venezuela. I think the potential for maybe a more military usage, let's say, in great power competition, also is something that many South Asians are concerned about. Do you think we're going to see more escalation in that sense, more military interventions or direct military actions to enforce great power competition or foreign policy?
Well, here I could just offer a very quick response, and I would say I certainly hope not. I certainly hope that this is not what takes place. But I think that the whole Venezuela crisis, I think underscores a longstanding concern of South Asian countries and other countries in the global South that the U.S. will, when it wants to, draw on its strength to do what it wants, and that includes using military force. And this is, I think, perhaps a wake-up call where there might have been a view that the Trump administration had said that it didn't sort of wanted to recede from the world, didn't want to be engaged in military adventurism, didn't want to have that kind of footprint. But clearly, that's not the case, given what happened in Venezuela. So I think it'll add to a sense of unease within the region. But I don't think there's any reason to think that the risk of military action and great power competition playing out directly in South Asia. I don't think that would be the case. I mean, the Trump administration, I think, has made clear that it wants to bring back the Monroe Doctrine. It's going to aggressively enforce that idea of the Monroe Doctrine. But the Monroe Doctrine, of course, is the Western Hemisphere. I mean, this is America's neighborhood, so to speak, very far away from South Asia or the Indo-Pacific more broadly. But so I think that's sort of a silver lining as as far as South Asia is concerned.
Well, fantastic. Thanks so much, Michael, for joining us and giving us your detailed insights on the current situation in South Asia and how it's going to evolve over 2026. So thanks a lot again for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great discussion.